Well, thank you ever so much for having me here today in Toronto. I was going to say warm and friendly Toronto, but friendly Toronto, I don't know quite how warm it is. Jim and I were talking a little bit before as the intros were going up, and we were both saying we should probably get our bios updated. He was commenting on how many years it had been since his marriage is now 6-7 years farther than his bio said. And I actually got my bio updated on my website this past week, so no harm to no fault to the organizers. There's a few things that are important on there, like my committees are gone and has changed somewhat and so forth. But I also had this little thing called a wedding I was involved in this summer as the groom. And like most guys, I married a wife who's much smarter than me, so my life has improved vastly already. She's smart enough to make sure that maybe I better stop before I get too far. That's the difference between being single. I would have made a joke that would have got me in trouble, and now that I'm married, I know when to stop. It's the older guys who are clapping at that. Today, we've been asked to talk a little about the abortion issue, one motion at a time. And Jim talked a little bit about the history, and Stephen's going to talk a little bit more, I think, specifically with what he's been involved in. When we talk about changing pro-life issues and changing the mentality one issue at a time, we're talking about the political aspects of what it is to be involved in the pro-life movement. And as been noted here, some of you specialize in the educational component, some of you in the spiritual component, some of you in personal ministry to people who have made difficult and sometimes wrong decisions. But there's also the political aspects. Because even, as has been noted, in countries where abortion is banned, there are people who break the law. But in Canada, where, as has been repeated frequently, we're one of the very handful of countries in the world where it's complete open season, we know that the political aspect is very important. And that political aspect needs to be changed and involved. And we need legislation to start moving it forward. So one of the things I'm going to do today as I explain and go through a little bit of the history is to try to help people think a little bit like a politician. Now, not every politician even thinks like a politician. I'm talking about the politician in general. There's always exceptions. We have, when the House is full, 308 members of Parliament, 308 different distinct individuals. You have municipal councillors. The municipality I live in has only 1,000 people in total and 7 politicians elected. Not very big, the elections. In fact, one of my communities has 78 eligible voters, and they had 6 candidates for the two council spots and 2 for the 2 mayor positions. So there's different politicians in different places. But there is an underlying thinking, and you need to understand where we're coming from, how things start to go forward. So let me give you a few tips. A few basic rules of politics. Number one, most politicians, they like their job and they want to keep it. It may seem a little obvious, but you don't see a lot of them getting up and saying, vote for my opponent, I'm sick and tired of this. A few retire and a few move on, but not many. So that's one of the important things to keep in mind. I like my job and I want to keep it. Then the next one is numbers are important, because numbers mean people, and people mean votes. Now this may not be quite the same in, say, Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Vladimir Putin's Russia. The numbers may mean something more in a bank account in Switzerland, but in a democratic system, numbers are important. If one person shows up at my MP office on an issue, I'm interested. If 2 show up, I'm even more interested. If 150 take time to write me individually, another dozen come up and talk to me about the issue, and I get a half a dozen more phone calls, I am very interested. And it doesn't matter what member of parliament you are in the country, where you are, this is important. And finally, the final rule of politics that all politicians tend to abide by, I'm safe, as long as no one finds out what I'm actually doing. Now, I said some of these all a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's all important what I'm talking about. Do you know how your individual member of parliament has voted on pro-life legislation, on legislation involving that? Now, in this room, I suspect most of you do. Maybe not all of you on everything, but think of this as Jim was talking about educating pastors. How many pro-life clergy in your constituency actually know how their local member of parliament voted on Stephen Woodsworth's motion respecting life? Think about that. How many people do you think actually know where their member of parliament voted on other legislation we've had? Back when abortion was effectively legalized in the Trudeau era and rolling forward, how many people do you know? Earlier this week, I was reading about American politics, which gets to be fairly interesting at this time of every 4 years. And one of the things they noted is that a large percentage of the American population could not actually identify which party in the U.S. tended to be more pro-life on the abortion issue and which party wasn't. This is the United States of America, where they have 24/7 political campaign ads on some of their TV stations for about 3 months before voting day. Okay? Now, most of you here, I'm assuming, are fairly politically active, vote regularly, etc. But that drives home a point. People don't actually know what they're voting for or voting on. When it comes to my constituency, I'm fairly outspoken. Even then, I suspect the vast majority of my constituents don't know which side of the abortion issue their member of parliament, Brad Trost, is on. You may find that a little bit surprising, but that goes to the joke about I'm safe as long as nobody knows what I'm doing. Because on a very direct level, a politician can then do one thing in Ottawa and another thing in the constituency. And people are shocked when they find that out, but it happens all the time. Now, I've started off with a little bit of the more cynical approach on politicians and so forth. But who are the people that make it there? Who are the people that are going to start to put out this one motion at a time, bring out motions, vote on them, talk about things in the public and political sphere? Preston Mann, former leader of the Reform Party, has a very interesting discussion about why politicians, why people get involved in politics. He's working with, I believe it's the University of Carleton, on a political management program. And he's got this fairly well broken down, and I'm not going to go into all his categories. But he talks about why people get involved. And you see this, House of Commons, other places, people get involved at different stages of their life. You get the successful professional. They're 45, 50, 55, they've been successful in the community, may or may not have strong political views. It's time to run for office. You know, they've been a member of the Rotary Club, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, maybe Liberal, maybe Conservative in Saskatchewan, maybe Conservative, maybe New Democrat, and they'll get out there and they'll run. People like that sometimes have strong views, generally don't. Then you'll get the up-and-coming young whippersnapper. Now, in politics, you're considered young if you're under 40. It's not like professional sports where you're considered washed up. So when I got elected at age 30, I probably would have been into that category. And while with the NDP accidental MPs in Quebec this time may be a little different, most of the young, eager, they've come up being political staffers, maybe they were involved in campus clubs. They're people who are often very active, often the more ideological. You'll see this all over the world, where you get the most conservative conservatives are often the youngest. People hear about Rob Anders and his human rights and various hard right things on a variety of issues. Rob was elected when he was 22. You want to find a hard left New Democrat? Talk to some of their younger members. Very ideological, very go forward. So people come from a handful of distinctive backgrounds. Some come through the civil service, some come up as campaign workers in constituencies, but they all come with a handful of different ways to approach it. And they come back to that point. They want to either move forward an agenda, or they want to get reelected for the sake of getting reelected. And that's one of the things that can be useful and help to influence and work forward on this agenda of one motion at a time. And this is something you've got to understand. MPs, people who come from a background like I do, we're not going to change our votes. Stephen was pro-life back in his liberal days. He's pro-life now. He's not going to change his vote. I'm not going to change my vote. Saskatoon Humboldt may change politically. I'll go down to defeat. A lot of MPs won't be like that. And a lot of MPs also don't come with this fixed views on issues like abortion, as Stephen and I do. Some of them can be fairly positively and sometimes fairly negatively affected by what happens in Ottawa. I think of one of my particular colleagues who got elected in a few elections past, and he didn't fill out any of the pro-life questionnaires or anything like that. He hadn't really thought about the issue. He'd been a successful professional in his community, and due to some incidences, got involved. He's voted with us on every pro-life issue. He's even showed up at pro-life caucus on occasion. But when he ran, when he first got involved, wouldn't have been pro-life. A handful of his people in his constituency have talked to him. Some of his best buddies in caucus are people like myself and Ron Renewed, another strongly pro-life MP. So they have positive influences on that. So this is something to follow up. Even if you don't know where your MP has voted, get involved, talk to him. A lot of these people who have come in as professionals from successful careers may not have as fixed views. They may be interested in moving up career-wise, and they may also be interested in learning a bit more, and so get involved. So that provides a bit of a background. Who gets involved, why they get involved. There's a variety. They're open, they're not always so open. By and large, they want to get re-elected. So where does that bring us to as far as the Canadian context? Now, I got elected in 2004, 6 weeks past my 30th birthday. All eager, had followed it for a few years. So I'm not exactly an expert on what went on back in the 80s and even in the 90s. But in 2004, I arrived in Ottawa, and we had a pro-life caucus already there. It was in the year where the Canadian Alliance and the Progressive Conservatives had merged. And so the pro-life caucus, which had been membership made up of 3 parties, because people like Elsie Wayne had represented the PCs, Leon Benoit, Maurice Bellicott, etc., had represented the Alliance, and there was liberal MPs there, retired MP, Pat O'Brien, Tom Lopel, people like that were regulars during that era. So it was a real cross-party thing. But one of the things I noticed at that point, the pro-life cause had been losing a variety of issues. And the majority of the pro-life MPs were very much from the opposition parties, used to getting beat on just about everything all the time, everywhere. So we hadn't exactly had a lot of successes, we hadn't exactly had a lot of issues put forward. But the ideas began to work together and people began to put motions together and get things going. 2007 would probably have been the first motion that was we worked on together that had issues that was involved on the life question. It was sponsored by Mr. Kenneth, the former MP for Sherwood, Edmonton East, no, I forget where it is, somewhere around Edmonton, Ken was. It was the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. And this was an interesting thing. I'm pretty sure a lot of you begin to remember it. It was the first time in a while that we'd gotten something far enough in front of the House of Commons that we began to get people to talk about it. And this is where we on the political side have been falling behind. I would say probably the weakest link in the Canadian pro-life movement had been the political. And that's because in our political party system, there hadn't been a lot of MPs willing, or even when they were willing, able with our rather cumbersome system to take a stand. But that motion was the first motion which got on the table and we actually got to vote on it at second reading. And it was important because it actually got people to start to think and talk about the issue. Jim was talking about Sun Media, National Post. There's people who are willing to talk about the life issue in a respectful way. And that hasn't always been that way. And one of the reasons MPs were reluctant to talk about it was you would get absolutely beat up in the media. You know you would lose. You absolutely were guaranteed to lose in the House of Commons. The party leaders would come in, the whips would crack the whips, and you'd get defeated. It didn't matter how hard you worked or whatever, and you'd get exiled somewhere. But one motion at a time, and that's where we started to get involved. And this was the first one. And it was important for one particular reason beyond the specifics of the debate and beyond the fact that it started to get people talking. I'll be winding down here in 4 minutes. So began to get people talking. And that's because we actually won the vote on second reading. And that was the first time a piece of legislation in the House of Commons had received a majority of the MPs since literally the 1960s, 50s, whenever, since we've really gotten into this debate, that actually said unborn human life has value. And the other side of the issue absolutely understood that. We might not have put, the majority of the House might not have put very big value, might not have put the same amount of value on it that we did, but it put value on it. And that was a bit of an important watershed moment. There were people who didn't exactly want to vote for it, who felt a little trapped by it because there were some people who were not pro-life strongly pushing for it. But that was important. And that was the first motion to get things talking. 2010, Rod Vernew, member of Parliament from Winnipeg, followed up. We didn't win that vote, but again, we got the vote out there and we got it to a point where the pro-life MP said this is going to be an absolutely regular, talked about issue on a long-term basis, and we will not be silenced. He only got, I think, 91, 92 votes for his legislation protecting against coerced abortion. It was known as Roxanne's Law. But again, another motion, we're starting to talk about it. No longer is abortion a forbidden subject in the political realm. And that's where we're starting to go. This year, as Stephen Woodsworth's motion, different people put different things into it. But people began to talk about it and began to discuss it again. And the pattern has now been set for the last few years. Abortion is again a regular topic in Canadian politics. It doesn't matter what any party leader says, anywhere, anytime. Members of Parliament have now established, both through physical actions and in their mentality, that we can start to talk about this again. The 2004 attitude that I arrived at, and understandably so, that we're always going to lose, we never have a chance, we're never even going to get something to the floor, that's gone, because we're starting to put it out there, one motion at a time. And it's interesting, we've got another one coming up, 2013, that's next year. And interestingly enough, if you actually follow what the official three parties' official line is, all three parties officially condemn gender selection abortion. Now, how that vote actually plays out and whether people are consistent with what they say and what they vote, we'll find out. But this is a change in our political culture. Votes are now coming up, and abortion is now a regular part of the Canadian political debate. Be it once a year through a regular motion in the House of Commons or something else, it's going to keep coming up. Be it through petitions, be it through discussion of defunding various pro-abortion groups. That's the change. That's where the political movement is going. We're catching up to the educational wing, and we need to keep going forward. Keep getting involved. We'll take some questions later on here. That's where we are, and we're going forward. Thank you.